Welcome back to Hot Flashes and Cool Topics, everybody. We are really honored and thrilled today to have Ruth Glenn on. Ruth is the CEO and the president of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And she also has recently released a really great book, Everything I Never Dreamed, My Life Surviving and Standing Up to Domestic Violence. So welcome today, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Bridget. I'm very excited to have the conversation.
Well, it is such an important conversation. And Ruth's story in her book and what she has done, it is sadly, it is terrifying. It's a horrible situation, but it is so important that women, that people everywhere, not just women, men, everyone hear
Yes.
your story. And do you mind just giving a little bit of the background of what happened to you and where you went from there?
Sure, absolutely. Um, as I outlined in the book, I grew up in a very poverty-ridden, abuse-ridden, all of those types of not so healthy environments growing up. And met this man when I was 16, and I thought surely he was going to be the one to fix everything for me, and truly believed that, and believed that our love would make it all work out. I had a child by him. It was very, very shortly after our marriage, when I was 19, that the abuse began. And by that I mean physical, emotional, verbal abuse. A lot of times when we look at domestic violence, we're thinking just physical abuse, but I must tell you, the wear and tear that he put on my psyche was something else. We stayed married for 12, 13 years. There came a time, due to some many circumstances, that I realized that I was experiencing domestic violence and decided to leave. Upon my leaving, and I think this is one of the most important elements to recognize in my story, because I do want to be clear, my story is not that uncommon. The little pieces of it, sure, but women endure this, particularly women, but you're correct, it can happen to anybody. Endure this all day, every day. I, after about the first 6 months of having left him, um, he kidnapped me at gunpoint. This was after 6 months of harassing, stalking, as I described in the book. And trust me, there was a lot left out. And then, as part of of the court case on the kidnapping, he became very, very escalated. Another really important point is because when we tell people to leave, we don't understand that a victim or survivor leaving can really escalate things. So 2 months later, he followed me, shot me, left me for dead. I survived that with no lasting physical injuries. Want to be clear about that. And then he went on the run for about 4 months. And my son, who was 15 at the time, he and I lived in hiding. And then he eventually shot himself and killed himself. It was a very sad day for us to find that out. It was also a very relieving day. And there are a lot of emotions that I went through. But as importantly is what happened after that, which was trying to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I was safe now. My son was safe now. So what do I do? And I just decided that quite frankly, I could either feel sorry for myself, as I felt like my mother had done for years, or I could figure out how to do something different. And so for the past 30 years, I've gone to school, got 2 degrees, which I'm very proud of. I had never been allowed to go back to school allowed. I kept my job, and then 8 years ago got this job with the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, being able to advocate in a way that I never thought I was going to be able to advocate. and just keep using what I call my survivor voice to bring survivors to the table to talk about these things in our society. So many survivors don't feel like they have a voice. And I'm a firm believer that in our policy and our practice, or anything that we do to address domestic violence, public awareness, that it must include survivor voices. And I happen to be privileged enough to be able to do that in a way where you can't stop me.
It's so, I mean, look who, you've met the presidents. You met
Yeah.
President Obama. Joe
Yes.
Biden really promoted, was it still in the Senate when he started promoting what your causes were? And that's so
Yes.
important to bring this just to the forefront. And there were so many important aspects in the book, and you bring up, and I've heard this time and again, just from different people, oh, why don't they just leave? And we've talked to other people that is the most, almost the most dangerous time.
It is. It is absolutely the most dangerous. And I'd like to spend 1 minute talking about that because it really is important. Domestic violence is about power and control. So it's not a, it's about, there are other risk factors that are included, such as substance abuse and all of those things. But domestic violence is about power and control. So when you remove control or power from someone who is abusive, their only goal is to regain that power and to regain that control. And that usually means that they escalate their behavior to do that. And I tell people all the time, remember, I was gone for 8 months before he shot me. 8 months.
Mhm.
It wasn't like it was 8 days.
Right.
Um, and every situation is different. So I want to be clear about that. Sometimes it is 8 days. But when we tell victims to leave, uh, we are not honoring and empowering them to make the best decisions for their safety first. They may have a million other reasons why they can't leave as well. But I think it's really important to go back to domestic violence is about power and control. And the reason we see the escalation is they are losing control.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
that was so evident in your book because it wasn't as if he didn't want you, it wasn't as if he wanted you all to himself, or he did, but he was being, he was having affairs, he was cheating, he was,
Yes.
so it was all about controlling you. And
Absolutely.
absolutely what was going, and that was so evident. And another point that is so important, that I feel like it's getting better. I feel like younger generations are better at recognizing this, but I still talk to people that are older generations. And I'm not trying to say that because not all older generations do this. Victim blaming,
Oh
victim
gosh, yeah.
blaming.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about why that is so harmful to be a victim blamer.
And as a society, I have to believe that we don't do it deliberately. It's not
Right.
intentional. But um, adult victims of domestic violence are considered by our society as adults first. So why aren't you doing something different? My favorite, and I think I even included it in the book, is my favorite line that I've heard myself, but many victims and survivors have heard is, it would only take one time. Well, I think that that would be good for you if that were possible. But to say that really puts the onus back on the victim to say, you can make the change. Well, I would challenge us to think differently. I think, it, you know, the dynamics of domestic violence would take us about 4 podcasts to talk about, but I'll
Yeah,
try to
yeah.
try to encapsulate it. Uh, these people do not come into the relationship either saying or thinking that they're going to abuse, right? Or saying or thinking, I want to be abused. You come into it with love and hope and all of those things, most of the time, the majority of the time. When that person starts being abusive, you're thrown off kilter. You're kind of like, what is happening right now? And then when you begin to think about that it's probably not right, it isn't right. You have a society that is giving you these subtle messages, these overt messages that, well, you can change it. Well, I would say that that's part of the problem, is our society does not yet understand that it is not that simple. I didn't say this in the book, I don't think, but I oftentimes think of being in a relationship with someone who is abusive as being a POW, which is you're under control, and before you know it, what has happened here? Um, I I like to think that I'm a strong woman. I've always been strong. My childhood taught me to be strong, and independent and um, self-sufficient and all of those things. I would have never thought that I would see myself in a closet being threatened, that I couldn't come out of the closet, right? Thrown in the closet with a vacuum. And when I think about that moment in time, I'm kind of like, yeah, it was that POW type of thing. And I don't want to minimize, what prisoners of war want to go, want to go through, what prisoners of war experience. And I don't want to minimize anyone's experience. Everyone's experience is different when they are being victimized and traumatized. What I am saying is that as a society, we subtly and overtly tell adult victims of domestic violence that it's their fault because they're an adult and they should be able to make different choices. It is so very harmful.
Right. It is. And, you cannot ever talk about a situation unless you've been in that situation.
Absolutely.
You don't know what a situation is. And I think, the older I get, the more I realize you don't know
Yes.
what a situation is for anybody unless you're there yourself in it. And I do know, with women and what's happened throughout life and years going through and the message that's been sent to women, so many women feel this shame or
Yes.
embarrassment, just anytime, anything that, like, even if something happens, I don't know, to one of my children that I don't want anybody else to know about, it's like this embarrassment or shame thing. But I feel like when women like you come out and you share these stories, then the first thing is other women don't feel alone in this.
Right.
They feel like
Yes.
this is okay, this has happened to someone else. This person is out
Right.
there and they're trying to do something to help other women like me. And it is just so important. And another thing that I thought it just is so eye-opening in your book is the way the media portrays what happens to women, domestic violent women, and just like your situation, the headline for your situation, what happened to you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Um, I'm also very privileged to be in a position, in my current position, to be able to talk to media.
Yeah.
They call for various and sundry reasons. I find it one of the most powerful things that I'm able to do, and particularly around public awareness, is to say, please don't use that language. That's not, you know, um, I'll give you an example, the Amber Heard thing about mutual abuse. I said, please do not use that language. You're minimizing. I haven't, we're not even talking about who the real victim or perpetrator is in this moment of time when you and I are discussing it. But I'm telling you, please don't use mutual abuse. So that's an example of the opportunities I have to change just the language. Now, I say just the language, but I cannot tell you how important it is. Um, you know, there was an altercation. Well, what altercation? It sounds to me as though this was domestic violence. And if we don't call it domestic violence, we are playing into the victim blaming. We're making it a mutual type of thing. When if you look at even the story, not even the police reports or anything like that, but if you even look at the story, I'm going to teach you a little bit about domestic violence dynamics, and I want you to look at this and tell me now, what do you think? Please, in your future reporting, take a harder look at what the dynamics of domestic violence are, and please call it that. So it's been a probably one of my greatest privileges is being able to, and they don't know any better, but the influence that they have on our society is really important. And if you, as the media, aren't using the correct language to describe what has happened in a situation in which a man has gone in, killed his wife, killed his 3 children, and then killed himself, and you talk about it as a murder-suicide only, we're missing something here. That was domestic violence. And that, I'm using the worst case scenario, but I find it such a privilege to be able to do that. And I encourage anyone to be able to do that. We have a person here who will write an op-ed in a moment, in my home state, who will write an op-ed in a moment to the editors and say, no, 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 that's domestic violence. And I appreciate her championing that.
Yeah, I think that is so important. And you see that coming out too, where they're just call this what it is, don't diminish what has happened to someone. And, your example, the headline, what happened to you said woman shot in head. And,
Yeah.
and you said, you don't know who did that. You don't know,
Right.
you could have done it yourself, with the
Right.
headline, it could have meant that, but let's call it for what it is. And let's bring this to the awareness of this, which also leads me to movements that have happened that are bringing more awareness to this. And sometimes some of it's very good. Sometimes there could be factors in it that maybe aren't as helpful. But I know in the book you bring about the Me Too movement.
Right.
Is another thing that happened
Right.
there. And can you talk about the good points of it, maybe some things that maybe you would change with that?
Yeah. So speaking of movements, I think one of the things that gets lost, and I will take responsibility that sometimes I forget. There is such a relationship between sexual violence and domestic violence. Such a relationship. You will find that those that commit sexual violence will commit domestic violence. So the Me Too movement was remarkable. I am really disappointed that we see it waning and waning and waning. But I do have to say that I feel that those that were harmed by sexual violence had that moment in time where they felt supported, they could speak up. I would say to you, we have not done the same thing about domestic violence. And it's bothersome. Domestic violence still is couched in that old school thinking. It happens in the home. We can't talk about it, again, the adult victim is responsible to some degree for this. So we're not going to get involved in domestic violence. I don't think people are doing it deliberately. I just think that's what our society says. I'd like to also remind us that another 3 to 4 hour podcast, we still live in a patriarchal society. 85 to 95% of victims of domestic violence are women. If we don't figure out how to make movements that hold men accountable for the domestic violence, but also includes men in domestic violence, all men are not perpetrators of domestic violence. I have met some of the most wonderful, thoughtful men in this past 8 years who want to do something. They definitely come at it from a different perspective. But how do we make movements that include them to help us tear down those patriarchal boundaries? How do we do that? I don't know yet.
and that was something, in your book too, where you were interviewing someone that was going to work for you, and you asked her, what do you think is the cause? And she said the P word, patriarchy.
Right.
And, it is. It's been ingrained forever.
Absolutely.
For the beginning of time. Right now I'm with my sister's vacationing with me. And so I was listening to parts of your book again on audio, and she was listening with me, and her blood was boiling.
Right. Right.
it was boiling. And
Yeah.
it's just, hearing just different things that were happening. I'm like, yeah, that happens,
Yeah.
And then she said she hadn't even read the whole book yet, and she didn't even hear the part. She goes, daggone patriarchy.
Right.
And I said, oh, that's what she blames, or
Right.
not she blames. It's the truth. So it's not even a blame, it's the truth.
Right.
And can you talk a little bit about how, that, and that would be a whole nother 4-hour podcast if you
Right.
explain the whole thing. But can you talk a little bit about why the patriarchy is such an issue and why this causes this?
I would challenge us to think our society in general is still patriarchal driven. So it's not only domestic violence uh, that is impacted by our patriarchal society, it's everything we do. We still have uh, a patriarchy of which white men are the patriarchs. We still subscribe unintentionally most of the time to what that means about how we address social issues, right? Domestic violence, sexual violence, ending our violence against women in general, quite frankly, any other social issue, Black Lives Matter. I mean, all of those things. We have this wall of patriarchy that prevents us. It's like every time we think we can get over that patriarchal wall puts up another layer of bricks and makes it higher and higher. What it does is it says to victims of domestic violence, you won't be heard. I'll use an example really quickly. What we're seeing is an increase in system abuse. By that I mean family courts, even first responders, that type of thing. We are seeing that because men are most frequently the abusive persons, they know and begin to use systems against their victim, particularly in family court. She's crazy. I want custody. Okay, I will split up custody, but I want this. I mean, the list goes on and on. But I got to tell you, as much as we educate court systems in particular, because that's the example I'm using right now, we still find that those court systems are getting sucked back into that patriarchal view, which is the man, as much as you want to say they're not, the man is given just that much more grace in which he can use the system to abuse. There are a lot of high profile cases that we can refer to even understand that. But so I just see it as this wall that our society has. And every time we think that we can do something about it, those walls are put up again.
Absolutely.
Or, that extra layer of brick is put on it. And we're once again faced with, well, now what do we do?
Mm-hmm. And you gave a really example about courts and how if they're going in for some case where they will do like the psychological testing or something to that extent. And a woman, well, she's been traumatized. Of course, she's not going to do well on this test. So the man comes out looking better. And then, it was another amazing statistic. And this is what set my sister off listening with me. And it was that the men that domestic violence, when you go to court of that, I forgot what you said, the percentage was of men that will fight for full custody.
Yeah.
As just another form of control.
It is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This is awful of me to say, and I pray that your audience will understand what I'm saying. But I tell people all the time, we get calls from victims quite frequently, and quite frequently it's about the court systems, family court systems. And I say to my colleagues and not necessarily the victims, but I said, if you just tell them, okay, you can have full custody and see what happens.
Yeah.
I wonder what percentage of them then would back off. Because I'm not denying that they may not love their children or that kind of thing, but full custody is oftentimes used as that tool to further abuse, to further control.
Mhm.
But tell them, yeah, sure, you can have full custody. I'll work out a visitation schedule and see what happens.
See what, yeah,
Now, yeah, now I will say there are plenty of men who love their children and want to do the right thing. And sometimes they think that is full custody. So I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about that population of men. I'm talking about the population of men who use that as a tool to further abuse.
right. And they get, then they see their victim in court. They see the
Yeah,
person they've been abusing in court.
yes.
So that's a whole nother
So
form of
imagine,
control. Yeah.
right. So imagine that victim sitting in the courtroom. Do you think she's going to appear as though she's got it together when she may be terrorized? She may be frustrated. She may be angry. She may be hurt. I mean, the list goes on and on. This person, the abusive person's focus is, I've got control. This is my moment.
And the outcome, depending on the outcome,
Yeah,
the abuse could escalate,
yeah,
because then
absolutely.
they went to court, they did this, and it didn't turn out for them. And then there they are right there to
Right,
be, their abusers free and could do whatever they could to hurt them again.
right.
And I mean, it really is a really great book for just understanding all of those situations, and that the work that needs to be done. And another interesting thing in the book, and we always wonder, why are there abusers? Why are? And it's not, what we have to say, it's not the person who's being abused, it's not their fault.
No,
And they, of course, the whole message is, well, what did you do? You get this message, what
yes.
did you do to make them
What
so
did you
angry?
do?
Yeah. And you talk about just statistics in general about, and it's not always the case, and there's a lot of people that don't ever abuse that come from situations. But can you talk about like what comes up as some of the indicators of someone who is typically an abuser?
You know, there's a couple of things that I would love to tell your audience, particularly as women. Um, it's not like they come with a sign that says, I'm going to abuse you, right? They are charming. They are all things. But I will say, we have got to trust our intuition. I think as women that we have been taught by this patriarchal society that we should not trust that intuition. It's either that we're overly emotional or we're overreacting or any of those things. If your intuition, no matter how charming, lovely, kind, any of those things, most of the time you're going to have a little thing in the back of your head that says, something's not quite right. I was on TikTok last night and there's a wonderful hashtag called domestic violence awareness. I know I happen to be a TikToker now. I don't
We are
have it.
too, and I'm going to hashtag that domestic awareness of violence. I'm writing it down.
Domestic violence awareness.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And feel free to, tag me as well.
Okay.
But there was a woman on there who explained it as perfectly, like I've been trying to. If we pay attention to our intuition, the red flags begin popping up. Oh, I'm really not in a place to meet your family right now. Or, who's that on the phone? Or, we can share phone plans. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Um, I love your children, but can we make sure that they do X in the room and blah, blah, blah. And I mean, the list is very long and we could go through it a lot. But if you begin to find yourself isolated, in other words, you don't have um, the nights out with your friends that you're accustomed to, of course you've got to meet somebody halfway. But if it's starting to be where I never see my friends anymore or my family, think about it. If somebody wants to know why you're on the phone with so and so, I I didn't know it was your business. Uh, you know, um, there are so many. Um, you know, I can handle the paychecks. Let me handle the finances. I can sign the mortgage. You don't have to worry about it. I mean, there are so many ways, either dating or entering into a marriage in which we don't trust our intuition enough. And I wish I had more concrete red flags. There are so many, and they really do depend on the individual. But just know that you have a right to say, you know what? I think we should stay engaged for a little while longer. Something's not quite right here. Or, it was so nice to meet you, and I'm glad we had those 2 dates. But I got to tell you, there's just not something working for me.
Mhm.
And being okay with, I want us to also know that just because we stopped something, because those red flags were going up for us, doesn't mean we can't figure out what it was. And maybe it wasn't quite what we thought it was. And we go back to it. And anybody that you say we need to stop right now that is not okay with that, there you go.
Yeah, there's a really big flag there.
Right.
And I have seen that in
Yes.
so many situations. I've seen that in my family.
Yes.
I've seen that, just friends, family. I've seen it. And, it's when you talk about these things like in the beginning of a relationship, these over really large grand gestures
Yes.
they're red
Yes.
flags.
Yes.
Yeah.
The love bombing.
Yes. Yes.
The I love you and you've got roses twice a week and all of those and moving very fast, particularly in a new relationship, moving very, very fast. I also want to remind all of us that um, victims don't go out looking for abusive persons.
Right.
Abusive persons go out looking for victims. I Because I've been victimized doesn't mean I'm a victim all the time. It's just that person has been very, very charming, very persuasive. You will find yourself doing things that you wouldn't otherwise do, and you're like, wait a minute, why did I do that? Oh, that's why.
Mhm.
So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I've seen that, and I know different situations will happen. And I'm from a really large family. All of our listeners know that I'm one of 12 children,
Oh my
and
gosh.
I'm number 11. And so I have older siblings, and I have a sibling that was definitely emotionally abused.
Right,
Definitely. I don't know if she was physically abused. She never shared that with us.
right.
She could have been. She's much older than me, but it is the beginning of the relationship was
Yes.
very give her everything she wants, and it just got so bad she eventually did leave. She eventually divorced, was in a different state, and he just passed away this past year. And she said, I finally feel free.
Yeah.
I mean, she hadn't seen him,
Yeah.
and he remarried, and she said, I finally feel free.
Yeah.
And it just she was embarrassed to share it with us, what was going on. We definitely could tell.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we could definitely tell things were happening. And it is, I mean, I've had friends that when I lived in a different state that I knew something was going on. I called her once and I could hear yelling in the background.
Oh, yeah.
And then she just said, this isn't a good time, and hung up. And then I was terrified for her. And then one time, she and her little boy just showed up at my house. They were running, the man was trying to get in her car. And she just showed up, and my husband was home, and he was like, come in,
Thank
and
you for being there for her.
I wish, and then we had to move. And I
Yeah.
still kept in touch for a long time,
Right.
and even said, hey, I will go back to where you live. It was several states away. If you need me to go to court, I can tell what happened. And then I was cut off. Like I haven't heard from her in years, and I can't find her. And I actually look up to make sure she's alive. And
Right.
she is. And I think you bring something else up in your book about just your mother was afraid to step in and help you.
Yeah.
Your husband threatened your mother.
Yep.
I truly, in my heart, believe that she has no longer kept in contact because she's afraid for my safety, that she doesn't
Right.
want her ex-husband something to me.
Absolutely. It's also a really interesting point that you bring up. That's also a part of that isolation it's kind of like the victim begins to do that as well. And it is for that reason. I want to protect those that I care about. I don't, so not only the shame and humiliation, but there is absolutely a protective factor in there.
Right.
Absolutely.
And, and when I was reading that in the book, I thought that is exactly what she
Right.
was doing. And
Right.
I just, I'm so proud of her. And I know it had to be terrifying for her to
Yes.
leave. She had a child, and uh, I was so proud of her for leaving, but then, there was no communication with me.
Right.
And so it's really interesting that you bring up just that intuition. It's like something goes up on your neck, or in your, the hair on your neck stands up or
Yeah.
something. And there's been situations, never, like I had a neighbor that tried to hit on me. It was so bizarre. My husband had to go out of town. His wife was out of town. These were our neighbors that we relied on to, we were younger, and just said, hey, who do I call to paint? Who do I call to do this? And
Right.
he like, oh, I'm going to miss you so much when you move, gives me a hug, puts his hands down my body. And I just kind of stepped back. And I didn't tell my husband for a whole day, because I
Yeah.
thought, I'm reading into this.
That's right.
And
That's right.
yeah, I told my husband, because I was feeling so weird. Like I was in this strange cover, and it's like I curled up on the couch. And then I told him, and he was, of course, not furious at me, furious at the man. And
Right.
I called the police, and luckily at the time, and of course I'm going to put this out there because I feel like it's real. I'm a white woman, and the police
Right.
came right over and listened to
Right.
me. If I
Sure.
were not a white woman,
Right.
I don't think that I would have been listened to.
Absolutely.
I know I wouldn't have been. It's not, I think, I know it wouldn't have been the same story.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And that's also another important point about why some women don't leave.
Right.
So as a white woman, you would say, well, I have the police. I can call the police. And I would challenge us to think that there are so many communities of women who do not feel that extra element of comfort. It is not the only reason that women don't leave, white women, women of color, and all of that. But think about it. And I'm so appreciative you brought that up. Um, I think that there's an assumption from some white women that you can just call the police. Well, no, I can't, because so many things can go bad, or
Yes.
at least that's been my experience, or at least I know that my community has experienced that. And it's not just about the person that's hurting me. It's about what am I going to do? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to the person that's hurting me? What's going to happen to my community? And the list goes on and on. So I really appreciate you bringing that up as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lot of reflection, and a lot
Yes.
of, hey, I know this wouldn't be the same for people I
Right.
know. I know it wouldn't be the same outcome.
Right.
I realize that. And, I also want to talk about, just, you talk about, programs, accountability
Right.
for abusers. And also, you also talk about that there's what can we do for accountability, but is there anything we can do to have abusers change what they are doing?
Yeah.
I mean, it's so hard that's one is a hard one.
Well, I think it's one of the problems also with our society about domestic violence. We're ready to do the victim blaming, but we're not ready to figure out what it is that drives some people to have that desire for power and control. What is that? Uh, we have not done enough as a nation, just talking about the United States, um, to identify what is that? Why is it? We used to try to blame men who grew up in abusive households. Well, I know many men who grew up in abusive households that would never think of harming anyone. We tried to blame, the list goes on and on. Well, they have a substance abuse problem, or they work too hard, or nope. Every man who is an abusive man, just speaking of men in general right now, has a different set of issues, just like victims come with a different set of issues. So there must be something there. And we just don't know what it is. And until we do that, and remember, unless we begin to really explore that, research it, study it, figure it out, we're going to continue to victim blame, and we're going to continue to have this public health crisis.
Mhm. And it is a
We're
public
not,
health
yeah,
crisis.
we're not
Yes,
getting to the root of it.
right. And I,
And
you
it's
know,
not the victim.
it's not. And that's, always, to me, I always think when I hear these situations or see this happening, why is that abuser being abusive? That is,
Yeah.
why is that abuser being abusive? And, there are different studies and tests that you mentioned in your book, and, court cases as well. It was interesting. I think it was in Virginia, the court case, where I think a lot of women, when they've been abused in court, maybe they'll drop the protective order. And you were talking about the case in Virginia. Before they do that, they gave like a questionnaire. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm so glad that's gone away. It really does put the onus back on the victim to decide. But
Yeah.
then the court is quick to blame the victim for redacting, or I'm sorry, what is it called?
I'm not sure what the term is, to take away the protective order or remove it. Yeah.
Anyway, oh my gosh.
And so I wonder if I have the book. I have the book, if I have the page.
Oh my Lord. Yeah.
Yeah.
So asking for a revocation of the PO, and there's another term for it, but we'll get back to that. So when we make the victim responsible for that, they become responsible for everything, including the abuse.
Right.
I am so grateful that some states have begun to say, even though that can be problematic as well, but some of them have begun to say, we're going to take this case as the state is going to be the state against the abuser, not the victim against the abuser. So that way, if she retracts or he retracts, let's talk about all of it, then it's still the state case. Now, unfortunately, we may not be able to get the victim here to testify, but as the state, we have enough evidence to say we don't need the victim's testimony. That relieves the victim of a huge burden, because we talked about family courts, but can you imagine sitting in criminal court as a victim facing your abusive person, and having a lawyer fight to say he has the right to have the victim in front of him. And there's also several jurisdictions now that are using video, which great.
Yeah.
Victim can appear, but she gets to appear via video.
Right. It doesn't have to look at them.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And just the trauma. I just think about the trauma that person is going to have to go through, and bring back the trauma of looking at that person again. It just
absolutely.
Yeah. And I just appreciate so much, because I looked at the time and I went, oh, I could talk to her forever.
Right.
Yeah. And I would just like to ask you, if you could talk a little bit more about the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and what would you like to see for its future?
So you and I are talking at a very interesting time. My book has come out at a very interesting time. It's so fascinating what's happened in my life in the last couple of years. So the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence is now a part of a merging organization with the National Domestic Violence Hotline. So we have become Project Opal. I am now the president of public affairs. And it thrills me to no end, because that public awareness that we talked about, I no longer have to do the kind of work that was really keeping the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence from doing the public awareness work and the policy work, to put it in a nutshell. So still the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence with the National Domestic Violence Hotline, but now I get to do public affairs, very much like what you and I are doing today, and continue to talk about it until I am blue in the face. And really hope that for my tenure remaining here, unknown to date, that I will be allowed to continue to have platforms for survivors, for victims, for advocates, and for children, for anyone who is being affected by domestic violence, and anyone who has a genuine interest in trying to figure out how we address this public health crisis. How do we, is it that we need to do more research and study on abusers? What do we need to do? So that's the future for myself and the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So really exciting time for me.
Oh, that is fantastic work that you're doing. And please, everyone, I encourage you, if you see this, I'm holding up the book, Everything I Never Dreamed, My Life Surviving and Standing Up to Domestic Violence. And it's Ruth Glenn. And I appreciate you being on the show so much. It's also on audiobooks. So I have both. And then I got my sister fired up. So if I could get more people fired up to join this, that would be great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Bridget, very much.